right now, I mean, today, an American can easily spend more on a morning latte than, like, 3 billion people will spend to survive the entire day.
Yeah, it's staggering.
It is. But calling those 3 billion people the third world isn't just, offensive. It's mathematically and historically completely wrong.
It's a total relic.
Mhm.
I mean, if you look at the visual backdrop we have pulled up for you today.
Right, this dynamic digital map of the globe.
Exactly. You don't see those clean, static Cold War borders anymore, and
Yeah.
you see this living, sometimes bleeding organism.
Yeah, like over in parts of Asia, you have these zones glowing with just rapid, unprecedented hypergrowth.
And right next door, or, just across an ocean, you see regions shadowed in total anarchy. Places where the very concept of a functioning government has just evaporated.
So whether you're prepping for a high-stakes meeting on global markets or trying to catch up on international relations, or you're just insanely curious about how our world actually functions, today's deep dive is designed to be your shortcut.
A shortcut to being profoundly well-informed.
Yeah. Exactly. We are unpacking a massive stack of source material, dissecting what we casually call the developing world.
We really need to look at the terrifying fragility of nation building, right?
Right.
And the deep scars left by empires.
And ultimately, we want to question the true hidden cost of what we in the West call progress.
Because the stakes here, I mean, they are the daily reality for nearly half the human beings on this planet.
3 billion people, almost half the global population living on less than $2.50 a day, and 25,000 children dying every single day due to poverty-related causes.
Which is just a crushing statistic.
It is. And why should you, the listener, care? Because a world rigidly divided into a rich us and a desperately poor them is fundamentally unsustainable.
Yeah, eventually that poverty and instability, it spills over.
But before we can understand the sheer scale of the problems facing the developing world, we have to unpack why our old labels for it completely fail.
Right, because the terminology we use, it totally shapes how we view the problem.
Exactly.
For decades, the global framework relied on this really simplistic three-tier system.
The first, second, and third world.
Yeah, the first world, which was the wealthy, industrialized West, democracies with stable institutions.
Yeah.
Then the second world, which was the Soviet bloc with state-controlled economies. And then, essentially as a catch-all bin, you had the third world.
Just throwing everyone else in there.
Pretty much. It encompassed all the former colonial areas, the less developed nations that didn't neatly fit into the capitalist West or the communist East.
But throwing incredibly diverse nations into a single massive category of, like, lesser than just seems intellectually lazy to me.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, it assumes all these countries share the exact same trajectory or the same problems.
And it fed into a perspective known as neocolonialism. So in the 1950s and 60s, prominent leaders from newly independent nations.
It's like Kwame Nkrumah from Ghana, right?
Exactly. Kwame Nkrumah, they argued that the rich nations of the North were basically continuing to exploit the poor nations of the South.
Okay, so the empires left, but the exploitation didn't.
Right. Nkrumah even published a book on this in 1956, predicting that this ongoing economic exploitation would inevitably lead to a massive North-South global conflict.
Wait, but a unified North-South war never happened, so was the economic exploitation not as bad as he thought? Or did something else prevent that solidarity?
Oh, the exploitation was very real. But what's fascinating here is that the imagined solidarity among all those former colonies simply didn't exist.
Because their paths were so different.
Exactly. Their economic trajectories diverged wildly. You cannot lump the economic miracles of Asia into the same category as the world's poorest nations.
Right, like China.
Look at China. Over a span of 2 decades, China reduced its poverty rate by over 600 million people.
Wait, 600 million? That is insane.
It is. That single country accounted for roughly 90% of the total reduction in world poverty during that time. And India has similarly lifted hundreds of millions out of extreme poverty.
So if third world is a broken concept because some of these nations became economic powerhouses, we pivot to using the term developing countries.
Which is better.
But even that implies a very specific destination, doesn't it? It assumes that as these nations develop, they will eventually look exactly like Western Europe or the U.S.
Yeah, urbanized, secular, heavily reliant on consumer technology. It's a totally Western metric applied to non-Western realities.
So how do the sources suggest we look at it?
To be more precise and look at where the suffering is most acute, the analysis focuses on the poorest developing countries, or PDCs.
PDCs, okay.
These are the roughly 20 or so countries with the absolute lowest per capita incomes in the world. And with the exceptions of Afghanistan and Nepal, almost all of them are located in sub-Saharan Africa.
Okay, let's unpack this because the income numbers in these PDCs are hard for a Western brain to process. We mentioned $2.50 a day earlier. If you told someone in Chicago they had to live on $2.50 a day, they would starve in a week. I mean, you can't even pay for a bus ride with that. How are billions of people physically surviving?
Well, this is where we have to look at the mechanics of purchasing power parity, or PPP.
Okay, explain that.
If you just look at nominal GDP, the numbers are incomprehensibly low. Pakistan, for instance, has a nominal per capita GDP of about $900.
Just $900 for the whole year?
Right. But its PPP is roughly $2,700.
Wait, so the dollar amount is $900, but they can actually buy $2,700 worth of stuff. Why the massive difference? Is it just that things are, like, cheaper?
Basically, yeah. It comes down to isolated labor markets and non-tradable goods. Think about a haircut.
Okay.
If you get a haircut in Chicago, you might pay $30 or $40. If you get a haircut in Lahore, Pakistan, it might cost the equivalent of $2.
Right, because the barber's costs are lower.
Exactly. The scissors aren't different. The skill isn't fundamentally different. But the barber in Lahore is operating in a local economy where housing, food, and basic services are priced exponentially lower.
Because the overall labor market is depressed.
You got it. And you cannot export a haircut. Right? It's the non-tradable service. So an American dollar converted into local currency buys significantly more basic survival goods there than it does here.
That makes total sense that $2.50 keeps a family from literally starving to death because the local rice and lentils are priced for that local labor market.
Exactly.
But I mean, keeping a pulse isn't the same as living. When you are surviving on that razor's edge, poverty isn't just about the bank account. It's a profound, terrifying vulnerability.
Oh, absolutely. The health metrics in the sources tell the real story here.
Yeah.
Look at a simple, cheap, preventative tool like a mosquito net.
Just a basic net.
Right, because millions of people cannot afford or access these nets. Developing countries see 500 million new cases of malaria every year.
500 million.
500 million. And up to 2 million deaths, mostly children. Add in 50 to 100 million cases of dengue fever.
Wow.
Poverty at this level is the inability to shield your children from totally preventable diseases.
And we tend to judge the economies of these nations without looking at how they arrived at this point of vulnerability.
We ignore the history.
Yeah. It's like evaluating a business's quarterly earnings without mentioning that their corporate headquarters was forcibly taken over, stripped of all assets, and managed by hostile competitors for a century.
That is a great way to put it.
To understand why so many nations are starting from such a profound deficit, we have to look at the hangover of empires.
Yeah, and if you pull up a world map from the year 1800, you only see 23 independent countries in the entire world.
Only 23.
Most of them in Europe, plus a few others like the US, China, Japan, and Ethiopia. Today, there are 192 independent states.
But that explosion of new nations wasn't organic growth, right?
Not at all.
Because if you look at a map of Africa right before World War I, the entire continent had been carved up. There were only 2 independent nations left, right? Ethiopia and Liberia.
Exactly. Everything else belonged to Britain, France, Belgium, Germany, Portugal, Italy, Spain.
Just sliced up like a pie.
And the imperial era was driven by a thirst for raw materials, new markets for industrial goods, and, let's be honest, a deeply ingrained notion of racial and cultural superiority.
Right, but the sources point out that the colonizers had distinct mechanics of rule, didn't they? Which left different kinds of infrastructural and psychological scars.
Yeah, that's crucial. The British approach, for example, was often indirect rule.
What did that look like on the ground?
They would identify local traditional leaders, chiefs, emirs, maharajas, and use them as proxies to extract wealth and maintain order.
Okay, that's a very calculated strategy. You keep the local face of authority to minimize rebellion, but pull all the strings from London.
Exactly. While selectively allowing a few locals to attend British schools to run your lower-level bureaucracy.
Wow. And how did that compare to, say, the French?
Well, compare that to the French and the Portuguese, who pushed a policy of assimilation. Their stated goal was to turn their colonial subjects into Frenchmen or Portuguese citizens.
just erasing the local culture entirely.
Completely. France even gave Algerians seats in the national legislature in Paris, treating the colony as a literal extension of the French mainland.
That's wild. And then you have the Spanish and the Belgians where it wasn't about indirect rule or assimilation, but pure, unadulterated extraction.
Yeah, the Belgian rule in the Congo was a horrific system of quotas and extreme violence. It resulted in millions of indigenous deaths just to harvest rubber and ivory.
But regardless of the style, the system was built on subjugation.
Right.
And when those empires collapsed post-World War II, the European powers didn't just gracefully hand over the keys and apologize.
No, the withdrawal was chaotic, and they left behind this architectural nightmare of artificial borders.
This is the single most destructive legacy, I think. When European diplomats sat in conference rooms in Berlin or London and drew lines on the map of Africa and the Middle East, they ignored every pre-existing ethnic, religious, linguistic, or tribal boundary.
They just drew straight lines through communities.
Yeah, I want to ground this in a modern equivalent for you listening. Imagine a massive corporate merger where two fiercely competing departments, let's say sales and engineering, who absolutely hate each other, are suddenly forced to share a single budget, a single office, and a single boss.
And half of the engineering team is locked out and assigned to a rival company.
Exactly. The immediate result is sabotage and internal warfare.
And that corporate sabotage translates to civil war on the national stage. Iraq is a classic example.
How so?
It's a nation constructed from three distinct Ottoman provinces of Shia, Sunni, and Kurdish populations just forced together.
Right, which obviously led to massive instability.
And Rwanda saw the Belgian colonial administration intentionally rigidify and inflame the differences between the Hutu and Tutsi populations.
They issued ethnic identity cards, didn't they?
They did,
Wow.
which literally laid the groundwork for the genocide there. Sri Lanka suffered decades of war because British colonial policies exacerbated tensions between the Sinhalese majority and the Tamil minority.
But the physical empires leaving didn't end the extraction. I mean, the flags changed, the troops went home, but the economic architecture remained intact. We've basically replaced imperial armies with economic protectionism.
Oh, totally. If you look at the World Trade Organization and the Doha round of negotiations, the dynamic is glaring.
What happened there?
In 2001, a coalition of developing countries known as the G33 tried to negotiate a fairer system. Many of these poor nations rely almost entirely on exporting agricultural goods. I mean, it is their only engine for wealth.
Right.
But rich Western countries heavily subsidize their own domestic farmers and place high tariffs on imported food.
I just struggle to see how an entire country accepts that math. If you're blocked from selling crops to the richest markets, why don't you just pivot? Like, why doesn't a poor country say, fine, we won't sell you our corn, we'll build a domestic tech sector instead?
Well, because pivoting requires capital, infrastructure, and an educated workforce. None of which they have because all their wealth was extracted.
Ah, so they are trapped.
Exactly. The physical troops may have left, but the tariffs and subsidies act as an invisible wall, keeping poor nations in a perpetual state of agricultural disadvantage.
And the talks repeatedly stall because of powerful farm lobbies in the West.
Right.
Okay, so imagine you are a newly minted prime minister of one of these newly independent artificial nations in the 1960s. The Europeans are gone.
Okay, setting the scene.
You have a flag, a national anthem, a population divided into hostile ethnic factions, and an economy entirely dependent on crops that rich countries won't buy at a fair price. You have to build a functioning state from scratch.
It's a monumental task.
The political science analysis in our sources lays out 4 agonizing, simultaneous challenges you face. Can we walk through those?
Yes. The 4 challenges of political development are nation building, state building, participation, and distribution.
Okay, let's start with the first one.
The first, nation building, is the psychological hurdle. How do you forge a shared identity among groups that were arbitrarily boxed together?
Right, because they don't share a history.
Exactly. You have to convince people to stop identifying primarily as a member of a specific tribe and start identifying as a citizen of a country that literally didn't exist 20 years ago.
How is that even possible? You can't just mandate patriotism to a brand new concept.
It requires an overwhelming unifying narrative, which is why the initial stage almost always demands a charismatic leader.
A figurehead.
Yeah, someone who becomes the living embodiment of the state. Think Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya, Jawaharlal Nehru in India. You need a larger-than-life persona to rally around.
And don't they sometimes use external threats, too?
Very often, yes. These leaders manufacture or exaggerate threats from a neighboring state to galvanize unity. The fastest way to unify disparate factions is pointing to a common enemy across the border.
Wow. But even if you convince 10 million people to salute the same flag, you can't eat a flag. Which leads to the second challenge, state building.
The plumbing of a nation.
Exactly. You need a bureaucracy, a police force, roads, power grids, schools, and this is where leaders hit the ultimate economic catch-22.
What's fascinating here is the sheer mechanics of it. To build roads and schools, a central government has to collect taxes, right?
Right.
But in a country where the economy is based on subsistence farming, where a family grows just enough maize to eat and maybe barters a little with their neighbor, generating absolutely no surplus cash, there is no revenue stream to tax.
You cannot tax a crop that has already been eaten.
Exactly.
So the government has $0 to build the road. How do you break that cycle?
You need an external shock of capital, foreign investment. But a foreign corporation isn't going to build a factory in a country that doesn't have roads to transport their goods, an educated workforce, or the political stability to guarantee their factory won't be seized.
Oh, wow. So foreign investment requires stability and infrastructure, but stability and infrastructure require foreign investment.
That's the trap.
Which accelerates the danger of the third challenge, participation.
Yes.
Because if you manage to scrape together enough capital to start building schools and mobilizing the public, you awaken them.
Right. You take a historically oppressed population, you give them a little bit of education and connectivity, and suddenly they realize how much they don't have.
So what does this all mean? They demand a political voice, right?
And they do. This is known as the dilemma of rising expectations. The moment a government delivers a basic service, the public's expectations for a better life rise exponentially.
And it outpaces the state's capacity to deliver.
Almost always. The state is trying to jog, and the public is demanding they sprint. If the government can't manage that energy, it triggers revolution.
And the most volatile fuel for that revolution is the fourth challenge, distribution.
Because wealth inequality in traditional agrarian societies isn't just a gap, it's a chasm.
Yeah, you have a tiny, ultra-wealthy elite who own almost all the arable land and a massive, desperately poor peasant class working it.
And this extreme, visible inequality is the core reason Marxism became incredibly appealing across the developing world during the Cold War.
And we should clarify, we're not endorsing or condemning that here, just looking at the mechanics described in the text.
Right, purely as a historical and socio-political dynamic. Marxism provided a highly structured, theoretical solution to the distribution problem. Seize the land and assets from the tiny elite and redistribute them to the masses.
Because if you are an impoverished peasant who is watching your children suffer from preventable diseases while the local landowner lives in a massive estate, Marxism isn't a high-level debate about economic theory.
No, it's visceral.
It is a visceral, immediate promise of survival and justice. Land reform, breaking up those big estates, was attempted by some governments, but it was usually half-hearted.
And Western-style social welfare programs were simply too expensive. They couldn't afford them.
This brings us to a major crossroads in international development. We assume that as people demand participation, the ultimate goal is a Western-style democracy.
That's the assumption, yeah.
But when you look at the mechanics of these fragile states, the sources raise a deeply controversial question. Which has to come first, democracy or development?
Right. Does a country need a democratic system to become wealthy? Or does it need to become wealthy before a democracy can actually survive?
I struggle with this concept. I mean, if a country is deeply impoverished and unequal, wouldn't a democratic vote be the absolute fastest way for the millions of poor people to demand resources from the rich elite? Why does poverty prevent democracy?
It sounds incredibly logical on paper, I agree. But historically, without a pre-existing middle class, sudden democratization in a highly unequal society usually collapses into oligarchy or populism.
How does that happen?
The ultra-rich use their immense resources to buy the media, manipulate the elections, or bribe the military. Or a populist leader rides the anger of the poor to power and immediately dismantles democratic checks and balances to become a dictator.
Okay, that makes sense.
The analysis lists the correlates of democracy, the conditions that allow a democracy to survive. Number 1 is national wealth. Number 2 is a market economy. Number 3 is a substantial middle class.
You also need civilian control over the military and an independent judiciary, right?
Yes, exactly.
So the argument is that if you try to install democracy in a starving country, it shatters. This is the foundation of the strategy of development debate in the text.
Right, and look at China's model. Their staggering economic success over the last 40 years makes a brutal but compelling case for prioritizing economic reform while tightly restricting political freedom.
Because for a population facing massive famine, the immediate priority isn't the freedom of the press, it is agricultural yield and caloric intake.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the theory is that market-oriented economic reforms inevitably create structural spillover effects.
Like what?
When an authoritarian government opens the economy to foreign investment, they create manufacturing jobs. Those jobs pull peasants out of the fields and into the cities, forming a nascent middle class.
And then they have to educate them to move up the value chain.
Exactly. They get exposed to global commerce and the internet. Eventually, that new middle class accumulates enough personal wealth that they demand property rights to protect it, the rule of law to enforce those rights, and eventually, a political voice.
Under this framework, democracy is the byproduct of wealth, not the engine of it.
Right.
But trying to sequence this is incredibly dangerous, and the track record in Africa is heartbreaking. In the 1990s, there was this massive wave of global optimism. The Soviet Union fell, and a democracy wave rolled across sub-Saharan Africa.
South Africa ended the horror of apartheid. Countries like Benin held free elections.
It looked like democracy was taking root regardless of the wealth level.
But the backsliding was swift and severe. Because the underlying institutions and middle-class wealth weren't there to support the democratic facade, it crumbled.
So what happened?
Military rulers in Nigeria and Côte d'Ivoire simply threw out election results they didn't like. And where state structures were weak and tribal tensions were high, you saw catastrophic failures.
Like the genocidal violence in Rwanda?
Yes. Rigged elections across the continent and horrific civil wars in Liberia and the Congo.
But then you have India, and India absolutely shatters this entire political science framework.
It really does. India breaks every rule.
It is staggeringly populous, it has deep, persistent, extreme poverty, it is incredibly diverse, 16 recognized languages, over 1,500 dialects, major religious splits between Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs.
Based on everything we just discussed about the correlates of democracy and the fragility of artificial states, India should have fractured into 50 different countries or collapsed into a military dictatorship decades ago.
Yet it has sustained a parliamentary democracy since 1947.
India is the great anomaly. To understand how India survives and how any developing nation actually tries to reach that threshold of wealth to stabilize their society, we have to look at the mechanics of what the analysis calls the development steeplechase.
A steeplechase, like the track event.
Yeah, it's a brutal track event where you don't just run, you have to hurl yourself over massive wooden barriers and water pits. For a developing nation, the race to modernization is a gauntlet of economic and social hurdles.
And the very first hurdle they hit is the trap of their own pre-modern economy. Many PDCs are suffocated by the monoculture trap.
They rely on a single agricultural commodity for almost their entire export revenue.
Like Bangladesh with jute, or Ethiopia with coffee, right? Or Cuba with sugar.
Exactly. And the mechanics of a monoculture are terrifying because you are entirely at the mercy of variables you cannot control.
Give me an example.
If you are Ethiopia and there is a sudden bumper crop of coffee in Brazil, the global supply skyrockets and the price of coffee beans plummets. Overnight, Ethiopia's national revenue is slashed in half. They have no diversified industries, no manufacturing base, no tech sector to offset the loss. The entire country's budget crashes based on weather patterns on another continent.
Let's look at the terms of trade hurdle, because this is where the math gets genuinely oppressive. It's like a kid trying to fund a modern tech startup by operating a neighborhood lemonade stand.
That's a good analogy.
Developing nations export cheap raw materials, unprocessed cotton, raw coffee, unrefined minerals. But to modernize their infrastructure, they have to import incredibly expensive, complex industrial goods.
MRI machines, synthetic fertilizers, industrial tractors, telecommunications gear.
Right, so the terms of trade are structurally rigged against the raw material exporter.
You have to ask, how many tons of raw, unroasted coffee beans does an economy have to export to generate enough foreign currency to buy just one imported MRI machine?
The ratio is staggering.
And because raw commodity prices fluctuate wildly, these nations frequently have to borrow massive amounts of money just to survive a bad harvest year.
Which leads to a compounding, crippling foreign debt crisis. But what if you aren't exporting coffee? What if you are exporting something the world desperately needs, like oil?
Oh, right.
That brings us to a massive social and political hurdle, best illustrated by Nigeria. Nigeria is incredibly diverse, nearly 400 distinct languages, massive religious divides, but it is also sitting on enormous state-owned oil reserves.
Logically, that oil revenue should have allowed them to leap over every hurdle in the steeplechase.
Exactly. It should have funded world-class infrastructure and education, but instead, it triggered the resource curse.
When a state relies entirely on extracting a high-value resource, the government doesn't need to tax its citizens.
And if you don't tax the citizens, you don't have to listen to them.
Exactly. The military regimes that ruled Nigeria for decades were profoundly corrupt. The oil wealth was siphoned off by a tiny elite.
And the bureaucracy was so hollowed out and mismanaged that Nigeria, one of the largest oil producers in Africa, regularly had to import refined gasoline from other countries.
Because their own domestic refineries were broken and plagued by corruption. It is the paradox of being the richest poor country in Africa.
Another hurdle is the sheer weight of ethnic division. Look at Sri Lanka, a beautiful island nation that spent a quarter century locked in a brutal civil war.
The Sinhalese majority, mostly Buddhist, and the Tamil minority, mostly Hindu.
The militant group, the Tamil Tigers, launched a relentless guerrilla war to secede. Over half the nations created after World War II have more than 5 major ethnic groups within their borders.
If you can't forge that unifying national identity we talked about, the steeplechase stops, and the country burns its resources fighting itself.
Which brings us back to the demographic and social hurdles of India. Here's where it gets really interesting. The analysis poses a fascinating question. Is India an elephant or a cheetah?
Yeah, for a long time, the global view of India was the elephant, huge, majestic, but slow, burdened by massive demographics and entrenched traditions.
Like the caste system. The caste system is a textbook example of an ascriptive society. In an ascriptive society, your social status, your profession, your educational opportunities are ascribed to you the moment you are born, based on your gender, religion, or caste.
You cannot earn your way out of it through merit, intelligence, or hard work.
The traditional untouchable class had zero social mobility. If a massive percentage of your population has no mobility, you completely stifle the entrepreneurial drive required for a modern economy. I mean, why innovate if you can never rise?
Shifting from an ascriptive society to a merit-based one is a massive hurdle. In recent decades, India has aggressively tackled this, cutting bureaucratic red tape, opening its economy.
Transforming from the slow elephant into a cheetah.
Exactly, boasting growth rates of up to 9% and becoming a global powerhouse in IT and software.
But the elephant hasn't disappeared. India has 1.14 billion people. The workforce grows by about 14 million people every single year.
They are producing a quarter of the world's new workers.
You have to generate an unbelievable amount of constant economic growth just to keep those millions of new workers employed and fed, let alone moving them into the middle class.
And feeding them brings us to the environmental hurdle.
Right.
To prevent massive starvation amidst this population explosion, countries like India, Mexico, and the Philippines adopted the Green Revolution.
They utilized synthetic fertilizers, modern irrigation, and engineered high-yield crop varieties to dramatically multiply food production.
Wait, so they used agricultural science to engineer crops that yield 3 times as much wheat, they fed millions of people, and they completely avoided a predicted global famine.
That sounds like an absolute triumph of human ingenuity. Where is the downside? Why is that a hurdle?
Because of the biological and chemical mechanics of how they achieved it. Synthetic fertilizers pump massive amounts of nitrogen and phosphorus into the ground, which forces the plants to grow rapidly.
Okay.
But those chemicals devastate the natural microbial biome of the soil. Over time, the soil loses its natural fertility and structure, leading to severe soil erosion.
Oh, man.
Furthermore, these high-yield crops require astronomical amounts of water, draining deep underground aquifers much faster than rain can replenish them.
And I imagine the runoff is bad, too.
The runoff from the chemical fertilizers poisoned local water supplies and created dead zones in the oceans. The Green Revolution solved the immediate, terrifying crisis of famine, but it did so by taking out a massive loan against the long-term ecological viability of the land.
So the steeplechase forces leaders to choose between mass starvation today or ecological collapse tomorrow.
It's a brutal choice.
But we've been talking about nations that are at least running the race, stumbling, taking damage, but moving forward. What happens when a nation trips over these hurdles entirely?
When the state collapses into anarchy.
What are the actual mechanics of a state collapsing?
Right.
The analysis provides several incredibly dark case studies. Let's look at Somalia.
Somalia is the quintessential failed state. In the early 1990s, the country was hit by a dual catastrophe, a severe drought and a brutal civil war driven by complex clan rivalries.
And when the dictator, Syed Barre, was ousted in 1991, there was no institutional framework to replace him.
Right. The state simply dissolved. The country fractured into hyperlocal fiefdoms controlled by heavily armed warlords.
The human cost was apocalyptic. By 1992, UNICEF warned that 2 million Somalis were facing starvation.
And the famine was entirely man-made.
It wasn't just a lack of rain, it was that the complete breakdown of law and order meant armed factions were roaming the countryside, actively stealing international relief food intended for starving civilians.
And murdering the aid workers trying to deliver it. Food became a weapon.
This triggered the U.S. and UN military intervention in 1992. The objective was purely humanitarian: secure the ports and roads to safeguard the delivery of food.
But the environment was so completely chaotic, the clan warfare so deeply entrenched and devoid of centralized leadership to negotiate with, that restoring order proved impossible.
The UN forces eventually withdrew in 1995, leaving Somalia without a functioning national government for decades.
It is hard to conceptualize that level of anarchy. There is no police force to call, there are no courts to mediate disputes, there are no schools.
Your daily survival is entirely dependent on the whims of whichever warlord with a mounted machine gun happens to control your neighborhood today.
And the lesson of Somalia is that a failed state doesn't just contain its misery locally.
Because Somalia had no coast guard, its waters became the epicenter of global piracy. Desperate men with speedboats and AK-47s began hijacking massive international oil tankers and cargo ships. Anarchy in the Horn of Africa directly disrupted global supply chains.
We see a similar devastating breakdown in Sierra Leone in the 1990s. The country descended into a decade-long civil war.
But the driving force wasn't ideology, it was the ruthless extraction of wealth, specifically conflict diamonds.
Right. The rebel group, the Revolutionary United Front, or RUF, seized control of the diamond mines.
They bypassed the need for a national economy by simply trading raw diamonds for weapons on the black market, using that wealth to fund a campaign of absolute unthinkable terror against the civilian population.
The RUF utilized tactics designed to completely break the psychological will of the country. They became notorious for mass amputations, systematically chopping off the hands of civilians.
But the most horrific mechanic of their war was the industrial-scale use of child soldiers.
Yeah. They abducted young boys, forcibly addicted them to narcotics to make them compliant and fearless, and brainwashed them into committing atrocities, often against their own villages.
Young girls were abducted for sexual slavery. They didn't just destroy the infrastructure, they annihilated the social fabric of an entire generation.
The violence only subsided after the intervention of 17,000 UN peacekeeping troops.
The international community set up a war crimes tribunal, which notably prosecuted Charles Taylor, the former president of neighboring Liberia, who had actively backed the RUF to get his hands on the diamond wealth.
But the trauma left Sierra Leone ranking at the very bottom of the UN's livability indexes for years.
Then there is Afghanistan, where state dysfunction literally altered the course of modern global history. Afghanistan is another complex mosaic of ethnicities, with the Pashtuns making up roughly 40%.
In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded to prop up a failing communist regime.
This invasion triggered a massive, decade-long proxy war. The U.S., seeking to bleed the Soviets, secretly funneled hundreds of millions of dollars in weapons and funding to the Islamic resistance fighters, the Mujahideen.
The Soviets were eventually forced into a humiliating withdrawal in 1989, but they left behind a nation in ruins.
Awash in advanced weaponry and thousands of battle-hardened fighters with no central authority to answer to.
Into that massive power vacuum stepped the Taliban, a fundamentalist group who seized power in 1996. They implemented a totalitarian regime based on a draconian interpretation of Islamic law.
The mechanics of their rule involved the total, systematic erasure of women from public life.
Women and girls were forced into burqas, strictly banned from attending school, banned from working outside the home, and subjected to severe public beatings for minor infractions.
All forms of modern entertainment, music, television, even kite flying were outlawed.
And because the Taliban had created a pariah state completely cut off from the global economy, they generated revenue by allowing Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda to operate freely within their borders.
They essentially leased out their sovereign territory as a massive training camp for international terrorism, which led directly to the catastrophic spillover of the 9/11 attacks.
It is the ultimate proof that a collapsed state is a global security threat.
But state failure isn't always the result of war or rebellion. Sometimes a functioning state is systematically dismantled by its own leadership.
Right, Zimbabwe under Robert Mugabe is a prime example of administrative suicide.
Mugabe ruled for 27 years. In a bid to maintain populist support, he initiated a policy of violently seizing commercial farms owned by the white minority without any transition plan or technical support for the people taking over the land.
And this is where the mechanics of an economy just shatter. It wasn't just that agricultural output dropped.
What else?
When the government violently seizes commercial farms, they destroy the foundation of the country's collateral. Farms are the assets that banks lend against.
Ah, when the property rights vanished overnight, the entire banking sector froze.
Exactly. Without bank lending, businesses couldn't operate. The national economy went into freefall.
So to pay the military and keep them loyal, the government just turned on the printing presses and printed endless amounts of currency.
Which directly caused world record hyperinflation.
The currency became so worthless that people needed wheelbarrows of cash just to buy a loaf of bread.
And finally, we look at Darfur in Sudan, where state dysfunction manifested as government-sponsored genocide.
Between 2003 and 2007, the central government, trying to crush a local rebellion, armed and backed ethnic militias.
These militias waged a campaign of mass murder, rape, and the burning of villages, systematically displacing 2.5 million people in a horrific campaign of ethnic cleansing.
When you look at all these case studies, Somalia, Sierra Leone, Afghanistan, Zimbabwe, Sudan, it forces us to confront a deeply unsettling theory proposed by the political scientist Samuel Huntington.
We in the West have this ingrained optimism. We assume that modernization is a linear track, that as old traditional systems break down, modern democratic institutions will naturally and organically rise to replace them.
Right. But Huntington argued that this is a dangerous fallacy.
He pointed out that while the forces of social modernization, like urbanization and mass communication, are incredibly effective at destroying traditional political systems, they do absolutely nothing to guarantee that a modern, stable system will take its place.
Frequently, the destruction of the old world just creates a massive void.
And into that void step the warlords, the drug cartels, the religious extremists, and the corrupt autocrats. Breaking down a traditional society often just yields pure anarchy.
That is a chilling realization, but it also raises a massive philosophical question that shifts the entire focus of our discussion.
Okay, let's hear it.
We have spent this entire deep dive operating on the assumption that development is the ultimate unquestionable goal, that the finish line of the steeplechase is a shiny, high-tech, post-industrial Western society.
But the analysis asks us to turn the mirror on ourselves and examine the paradox of overdevelopment.
This touches on the concept of ethnocentrism, the deep-seated, often unconscious bias of Western experts who assume that our specific way of living is the objective standard of human progress, and that traditional ways of living are merely primitive obstacles to be overcome.
This raises an important question. If we honestly evaluate late-stage development in the West, the biological and sociological side effects are severe.
We are talking about societies plagued by massive urban congestion, deep environmental pollution, and the looming catastrophe of global warming.
We have epidemics of stress-related illnesses, profound social isolation despite digital connectivity, and massive crises of illegal drug use and mental health breakdowns.
We have achieved unparalleled, staggering material wealth, but the mechanics of acquiring that wealth seem to have fractured our human connection and degraded planetary health.
It echoes a warning from the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, written over 270 years ago in 1750. He observed, "Our souls have been corrupted in proportion to the movement of our sciences and arts towards perfection."
1750. And it feels like he's diagnosing the modern internet age.
It really does.
All of this technology, all of this accumulated capital, has it actually optimized human happiness, or has it just engineered a highly efficient system of stress and isolation? Are we absolutely certain that our hyper-individualistic, hyper-consumerist model is the finish line every other nation on Earth should be bleeding themselves dry to reach?
It demands a reassessment of international relations. Should the overdeveloped nations of the global north perhaps redirect their focus towards solving their own structural crises, like deep vulnerabilities to global pandemics, soaring inequality within their own borders, and massive carbon footprints, rather than constantly dictating the economic path and political pace for developing nations?
Are we pushing fragile states to run brutal steeplechase that ultimately ends in a different, highly sanitized kind of trap?
It's a heavy thought.
That is exactly what I want you, the listener, to reflect on today. Is the Western model truly the pinnacle of human organization? Or have we merely traded the brutal, immediate problems of poverty for the slow, grinding pathologies of overdevelopment? Let's take a breath and look back at the incredible ground we've covered.
We started by dismantling the outdated, mathematically flawed label of the Third World, exploring the deep mechanics of purchasing power parity to understand how billions survive on the margins.
We traced the scars of colonialism, looking at how the arbitrary, crazy quilt borders drawn in European capitals engineered generations of ethnic conflict.
We watched fragile, newly independent governments attempt to run the development steeplechase, desperately trying to overcome the traps of single-crop monocultures, rigged international trade policies, and explosive demographic pressures.
We stared into the abyss of state failure, analyzing the mechanics of how places like Somalia, Sierra Leone, and Zimbabwe collapsed into anarchy, exporting piracy and terror to the globe.
And finally, we questioned the finish line itself, exploring the deeply unsettling paradox that our own overdeveloped societies might be fundamentally corrupting the human experience.
And as we close, I want to leave you with a final thought that bridges everything we've analyzed today with the immediate future.
What's that?
We have dissected the agonizing, decades-long steeplechase of development, the slow, grueling mechanics of building roads, levying taxes, educating a workforce, and forming a stable middle class. But we are currently entering the age of generative artificial intelligence and synthetic bioengineering.
Oh, well. These are the ultimate apex tools of Western overdevelopment. What happens when these technologies bypass the steeplechase entirely? What happens when decentralized AI or autonomous drone capabilities fall directly into the hands of fragile, deeply fractured states, or the non-state warlords operating within them?
Will this unprecedented technological leapfrog effect empower these nations to instantly solve their bureaucratic and distribution challenges, creating sudden, localized utopias? Or will it strip away the final layers of state control, supercharging the mechanics of anarchy and empowering extremists to achieve a scale of destruction that makes the 20th century look like a rehearsal?
That is a terrifying and utterly fascinating question. When you look back at that world map we started with, the one that looks so clean with its sharp borders and distinct colors, remember that the lines on the map don't tell the real story.
They really don't. The story is in the incredibly complex, often violent, and deeply human mechanics of how those borders are maintained, how wealth is extracted, and the desperate, chaotic struggle to build a functioning society from the ground up. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. Keep questioning the map, keep looking beyond the borders, and we'll see you next time.